In honor of the 2024 US presidential election, I like to be a little patriotic and talk about one of the most influential presidents in US history. His name is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, commonly known as JFK, and he was the 35th president of the United States of America. And the reason why I'm talking about him on my channel is because he is or was an INTJ, and even more so, he's a fantastic representation of what a healthy INTJ would do in a position of power. Similar to my previous video about Marcus Aurelius, I'm not going to go into his politics, nor am I going to critique the decisions that he made while he was in office, or at least go too in depth into it. Hindsight is 2020, y'all. So whatever decision that he made while in office, I'm pretty sure he thought it was the best decision at the time, regardless of the outcome. In regards to the claims about his infidelity and his playboy nature, guys, we're past that after President Bill Clinton and President Donald Trump. What he does with his cucumber is none of my business as long as he can lead the nation. The intention of this video is to humanize JFK as a real person. Just another INTJ who happened to eventually become the leader of this great country that I personally love and adore, regardless of all the flaws that comes with it. He was an INTJ in power that intended to do what is right for his people. Guys, I didn't realize how much of a badass he was until I started researching about him. JFK didn't need to become president. He was already an accomplished person before his presidency. He is a freaking war hero who earned a Purple Heart Award while serving in the US Navy. He is the only president in U.S. history to have served with a Purple Heart Award. And the reason why that award is important is because that meant he got injured while serving in the military in the line of duty. This dude is a freaking hero before he was even president. And I'll go more into details about that later in the video because it was an amazing story about how he saved the lives of himself and his men. Not only is he a decorated war veteran, JFK is also a Pulitzer Prize winner. A Pulitzer Prize is the highest national honor given to literary achievement, and he received it for the book that he wrote called Profiles in Courage, that teaches patriotism and unselfish service to the people. He didn't have to become their president. He already achieved things in his life before presidency that most people dream about achieving. But similar to most INTJs, he had certain beliefs that he cared about, and he believed that he was the right person to implement them. And most of those beliefs were unpopular in comparison to the status quo of the time. JFK believed in justice for all, regardless of the pigmentation of your skin. In addition to his belief, he led the nation through one of the most difficult times we've ever faced during the Cuban Missile Crisis and international arms race that could have wiped out all of humanity. Lastly, he played an instrumental part expanding the once thought human limitation by putting the first person on the moon. He sadly didn't live long enough to see it happen, but he set things in motion for the accomplishment to be achieved. A notable mention that I'm not going to go much into is that he's also the person that created the Peace Corps, because I know people have mixed feelings whether you served in it or not, but the Peace Corps is very on brand for being an INTJ, for an INTJ to create a program for people to help people around the world in need. Not helping people himself, but helping people that want to help people by creating a way for those people to help people. If there's one word that I could use to describe JFK, that word would be a visionary. But the most relatable thing about JFK is not his anti-vision, but instead that he had haters regardless of what he did. John F. Kennedy was the youngest president the United States have ever elected in office in 1961 at the young age of 43 years old. And he was also the youngest president that has ever passed away at the age of 46 years old. For those of you watching that aren't from the States or don't really care too much about politics or political history, JFK was the most recent president that was assassinated, and there are still people alive today that remembers the event. It really didn't happen that long ago. My real life uncle is actually going to guest star later in this video to provide his own personal experience living through the Cuban Missile Crisis, so we'll get to hear firsthand how it felt living during that time. It was a scary moment. Before I begin, I need to address one of the most common misconceptions about JFK. He is not an ESFP or an SE dominant user. JFK is remembered as being very charismatic, charming, and an optimistic personality, which I agree with the usage of extroverted sensing because it fits the bill for what extroverted sensing actually shows. But guys, healthy INTJs know how to utilize SE as well. I'll go more in depth in his introverted nature a little further in this video, but I think it has more weight to hear about his INTJ-ness from the person that he ran against for presidency. Ladies and gentlemen, here's our 37th president, Richard Nixon, talking about JFK.
Looking at the Kennedys, I make an interesting comparison. First, Edward Kennedy was the best politician of the three. He is the best politician. He's gregarious. He loves it. He's warm. John Kennedy, on the other hand, was quite a shy person, really. It was not easy for him to get out and shake hands and the rest. He did it very well. It wasn't easy for him. He was a quite private person.
We're going to start this video off by briefly going over his childhood. And I'm not going to sugarcoat things. JFK was born into a wealthy family. Like rich, with connections everywhere, even in politics. It played a huge part in his accomplishments, but that shouldn't downplay the accomplishment that he had because he still had to earn them. And before anyone leaves a negative comment about his privilege, yes, he had a leg up in comparison to those who are less wealthy, but you'll hear why I don't mind after I explain what he did with his privilege. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, also known as Jack, because Jack is a nickname for John for some reason, was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second oldest of 9 siblings. He had an older brother, 3 younger brothers, and 5 younger sisters. And according to the websites about his family, they were all a tight-knit family, even the parents. Little Johnny suffered frequent illnesses as a child that continued into his adulthood. It wasn't known to the public until after the assassination, but JFK was dealing with health problems while serving as the president. But his health issue never stopped him from living a complete life. As a child, he was known to enjoy being very active, leading to winning individual sailing competitions. He was also part of the Harvard sailing crew that won national championships, and he even gave boxing a try. But the part of JFK that stood out the most compared to his siblings was that he possessed a keen intelligence, a gift for creative wit, and that he had a buoyant charm to him. If that doesn't sound INTJ enough for you, listen to this next part. While attending private school as a child, John hated authority. He had zero interest in academia. His teachers saw him as rebellious, and he consistently earned mediocre grades to the point where his own dad were worried that he would never reach his potential. But that all changed once he entered college and was able to choose a field of study which he enjoyed. JFK toured Europe his freshman year of college, which ignited his interest in international politics. This is the part where introverted intuition starts showing. For those of you who aren't aware, one of the things that NI-DOMs love to do is seek perspective, which looks similar to introverted thinking, but the main difference is that we're not necessarily seeking the truth, as in why something is the way it is. NI-DOMs seek why people believe something is the truth. We're more curious about why someone arrived to a conclusion than what actually is the conclusion, because their truth is their reality, even if it goes against actual reality. And that's what JFK spent his time doing in college. He visited Italy when Mussolini was the dictator, and Mussolini is credited to be one of the founders or early adopters of fascism. He visited Germany when Hitler was in power, and most of us knows Hitler because he caused the Holocaust. He questioned Spanish refugees during the Spanish Civil War, spoke to people about their experience living in communist Russia, and even learned about the Zionist movement happening in Palestine. He saw injustices around the world and spent his time in college questioning why things are happening. As a result, he wrote his Harvard senior thesis called Why England Slept, which became a national bestseller after his dad published and promoted it. Why England Slept described why isolationist tendencies, compounded by the sluggish nature of democracy, delayed Britain's military power, allowing Hitler to gain the upper hand. Lots of journalists hated it because it went against their own understanding or belief of the situation. But in true INTJ fashion, this guy spoke his mind regardless of all the backlash he was going to receive and owned up to his own belief. And it was a bestseller. To wrap up his childhood, this dude graduated college already being a national bestseller. Let's hear about what he accomplished during his young adulthood before politics. JFK served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, where he was an officer on Patrol Torpedo Craft 109, commonly known as PT-109. The purpose of a PT boat is to cut enemy supply lines as well as harass enemy ships, amongst other vital missions. It's a very small boat that holds up to roughly 15 people at a time. For comparison, a United States Navy carrier can hold up to 5,000 people at a time. So PT-109 was a very tiny boat. 2 years after he joined, JFK became a freaking hero. I love this story so much, I'm gonna tell it, but like an abridged, summed up version, so get ready for this. On August 1st, 1943, PT-109 was stationed around the Solomon Island, which is a chain of islands near the Papua New Guinea or near Australia. At about 2:30 a.m., a Japanese destroyer rammed into the right side of PT-109, ripping away a huge chunk of the ship. JFK was knocked around the cockpit, most of the crew fell into the water, and one of the engineers somehow magically escaped the bottom level of the ship while also being badly burnt by exploding fuel. JFK was the officer in charge, so he was the person responsible for the lives of his men. And for those of you who never served or don't plan on serving in the military, the chain of command is extremely important, especially during the time of casualty, because that's how you survive. Instead of a bunch of conflicting voices trying to overpower each other, trying to figure out what to do, you're all on the same page, listening to the same person with the same vision. Your unit will live or die together. So being the officer in charge is very important. Or just the person in charge is important. But just because he was the person in charge, that doesn't mean he didn't put himself in harm's way to help his unit. It is even written that during this casualty, he himself jumped into the water and helped an exhausted shipmate from drowning by dragging that person back to the boat. All the men were exhausted. 2 of them perished during the collision, and they were afraid to fire a flare gun for help in fear of attracting enemy forces. Also, the boat was sinking, so they decided the best idea was to abandon ship and swim to Olasana Island. That was roughly 3.5 miles or 5.6 kilometers swim away. Olasana Island was close to a passage where U.S. or Allied fleet frequently crossed, so it was their best hope for rescue. PT-109 capsized the next morning. JFK's men claimed, his men, not JFK himself, but his men claimed that while swimming to the island, JFK was towing a shipmate by clamping the life jacket's belt in his teeth while swimming. This dude was literally swimming for dear life 3.5 miles while towing someone with his teeth. And the story just began. They eventually made it to an island, but they still weren't safe behind enemy lines. Shortly after they made it to the island, JFK decided to swim down a canal, island hopping and clinging to reef to scout the area for enemy ships. He even claimed to have treaded water for over an hour until he decided that enemy ships weren't around. But a Japanese ship was only one of many concerns. A strong current nearly drowned him on his way swimming back to his men because exhaustion finally caught up to him, and they were stuck on an island with no food or fresh water. On August 4th, 3 days after the shipwreck, JFK led his men back into the ocean to swim to another island, hoping to find food or fresh water, while also hoping to be rescued by Allied ships. And again, he bit the belt of his shipmate while swimming and dragging that shipmate to another island. But the next island wasn't any better. There was still no fresh water to be found, and the coconuts found on the island made everyone sick. To make things even worse, the weather got horrible. It started raining, and the temperature dropped tremendously. They were all exhausted, slowly dying of hunger and slowly dying of thirst. But our future 35th president didn't lose hope and was still determined to save the lives of himself and his men. The next morning on August 5th, he decided to scout the area with another person and found the wreckage of a small Japanese vessel. Luckily, they found Japanese candy, which they ate for food, a tin of fresh water a little ways off, and they discovered a canoe hidden in the bushes. On their way back to drop off the food and water to the men, they spotted 2 islanders that they tried to wave down for help, but the islanders hastily left in fear of dying. With no help in sight, JFK took it upon himself to take the canoe out to the original island, Olasana Island, hoping to come in contact with an Allied vessel. Still, no ships were found. But luckily, on that same night, he ran into the 2 islanders from earlier and discovered that they were both scouts of the Allied forces. The next morning, on August 6th, JFK followed the 2 islanders to a boat hidden nearby, and it was unclear whether the boat was manned by Allied forces or Japanese forces. So JFK wrote a message on the husk of a coconut, and the 2 islanders left with the message to deliver if it happened to be Allied forces. It was a waiting game at this point. If it was an Allied ship, they were saved. But if it was an enemy ship, they have to continue struggling trying to figure out how to survive. But luckily, the next morning on August 7th, a group of islanders appeared with food and water and instructions from local Allied coast watchers on how to contact Allied forces for help. The worst is finally over. JFK saved his men, and they all made it home. Guys, that was a crazy ass story, and the main character was a former president. For 6 days, JFK was relentless in saving the lives of himself and his men. The point of the story isn't that INTJs are more prone to survival in catastrophic incidents, because I feel like any person who wants to survive will do what it takes regardless of what your type is. The purpose is to show how much of a badass JFK was outside of his presidency, and that he didn't need to be president to have lived a complete life. Also, I find it comedic that when people ask how he became a hero, people would get annoyed when he would answer that question laconically. It was involuntary. They sank my boat. The final achievement that I want to highlight before I go in depth about his political career is that he is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And the subject that he wrote is one of the most INTJ shit ever. In 1956, while JFK was the junior senator of the state of Massachusetts, he published a book titled Profiles in Courage. It was a series of short biographies describing acts of bravery and integrity by 8 different U.S. Senate. Sounds normal enough. So what makes it so INTJ? The topics that he focused on were the senators who defied the opinions of their party or constituents to do what they felt were right and suffered severe, harsh criticism and losses in popularity as a result. That sentence is the epitome of life of a healthy INTJ. Or NINTE will tell us what actually needs to happen in order for things to improve. Trickster FE will tell us that it doesn't matter what anyone says or think because this is the just and fair path. Introverted feeling will guide us to what is morally correct and ensure that there is an ethical line that we don't cross. And extroverted sensing will make sure that we're able to deliver on the dream. And INTJ is willing to be the villain of the story if that means that things will improve for the better. We are willing to make the unpopular choices not because we want to be different, but because we wholeheartedly believe that it is necessary for change. Now that we have a basic understanding of his accomplishments prior to being president, let's start talking about his political career. As mentioned earlier, the media remembers him as a handsome, charming, and charismatic person, but that's not how he was described by the people who knew him. His congressional colleagues often described him as a very quiet and reserved person. Some even called him distant. JFK didn't fit the stereotype of a politician. He didn't enjoy the bantering, the spotlight, or the constant social interaction of being a politician, where it's even written that he was worried that his loner personality made him less qualified to be in politics. Even though he has given some of the most quotable speeches in history, this dude wasn't a natural public speaker. It is said that his earlier speeches were often delivered flat, lack of emotion or force, and often tone deaf. JFK geek mode so hard earlier in his career that he would cite Greek philosophy or talk about Roman history while he was giving speeches to farmers in the state of Wyoming. He didn't know how to read his audience. What drove JFK to be successful in politics is the same thing that drives any INTJ to be successful. He didn't care for the politics or the glamour of the position as much as he cared more about the ability to execute his ideas. He had this grand NI vision and he wanted to use TE and SE to make it happen. So during his 8 years in Senate prior to becoming president, he continued to develop his lower functions, introverted feeling and extroverted sensing. His speeches kept improving over time, where he was able to tug on emotional heartstrings while presenting, and he was able to display his charm while in front of the masses. But working on his lower function isn't the reason why he stood out. No. As an INTJ, he will always be remembered for his use of his dominant function, introverted intuition. JFK is remembered to give some of the most remarkable and insightful speeches about international affairs as a senator. His NI kept seeing patterns. He would vocally express his predictions, most of them actually becoming reality, and he continued to provide strategies to improve any of the situations that he would talk about. His NI insight made him stand out compared to his peers. So not too long after, he ran for president and he won. I'm not going to spend too much time on his campaign or why he won. He had daddy's money and he has daddy's connections. He worked hard, but he wouldn't have won without the wealth that he was born into. And he barely won the election. But let's be real, guys. A win's a win. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce everyone to the 35th President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It wasn't easy being president of the United States. Domestically, we have so many different pockets of culture depending on where you're located in the country. I don't think most people outside of the United States understand how large this country is. You can fit the UK 40 times in the United States. 40. 40. So imagine being the president of this large landmass and the people that resides in it. The point I'm trying to make is that each U.S. state essentially can be seen as its own country because it has its own culture that is unique to the state. I believe that this context is important for one of the biggest accomplishments that JFK achieved as president. Because of the large size of the country and because we follow democracy, this country tends to be divided on certain topics. And one of the biggest division during the 1960s was called the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a nationwide movement for equal rights for Black Americans, calling for an end to racial segregation and exclusion. And the reason why it's important is because the prosperity and wealth that America has accumulated has been built off the back of Black slaves, and the enforced segregation of the Jim Crow laws are inhumane. Segregation was racial apartheid, where people of color, especially Black Americans, were treated as second-class citizens. But that important was only domestically. I'm not going to go over how the Civil Rights Movement changed the world because that would take way too much time. How it influenced the decolonization in Africa and Asian countries, how it gave birth to the unionization of Black folks around the world, and the most important thing is that it reminds all the first world countries that we're all human, that deserve basic human rights regardless of the pigment of our skin. But what we're taught the most in schools were segregation in public places, such as black folks only allowed to sit in the back of the bus, whites only restaurants, or whites only schools. But it was deeper than that. It went way deeper than that. It led to black folks being turned away from life-threatening emergency treatment, such as a black woman giving birth on the sidewalk outside of a hospital because the hospital refused to admit her just because she's black. Parents pleading and begging for doctors to treat their wounded child and being denied because of the color of their skin. And black patients dying in the process of waiting for safe transportation to and from the hospital because white patients skipped the line for priority. There are even stories that I can't confirm or confirm anywhere online that certain areas in the US were so racist that black folks couldn't even go to the dentist and instead get their teeth treated by veterinarians, pet doctors, just because of the color of your skin. Racism, classism, or apartheid of any sort is unethical, period. And if this portion of the video is making you feel uncomfortable, I find it strange that you're okay with me, an Asian person, gassing up a white guy for the next 20 or 30 minutes, but you're not okay with me briefly going over real American history. Selective outrage is crazy. How this ties back to JFK is that in 1963, he announced to the nation that he, as president of the United States, supports the civil rights movement. Not only did he say he supported the movement, INTJs don't care about that FE shit and won't just say things just to make people feel better. He went deeper than that. He submitted a special request to Congress asking to strengthen voter rights to black Americans and to provide assistance to end segregation. His stance on the civil rights movement aligned with the book Profiles in Courage, where he took the stance that he believed was morally correct, even if it meant going against his team or party. I need you guys to understand the gravity of what he did. JFK was a white male born into a wealthy white family in New England with a thick Boston accent. He attended Harvard Law School, which is an Ivy League college, and his family had so much wealth that he was able to travel around the world without worrying about his next meal. He could have easily turned a blind eye to the injustices happening to black Americans and lived the rest of his life from the wealth that his parents or grandparents accumulated, but he didn't. 100 years after President Lincoln freed the slaves, JFK was the first president to do what he believed was right, even if it meant going against his party, to fight for equality.
But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street. I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. This seems to me to be an elementary right. Its denial is an arbitrary indignity that no American in 1963 should have to endure, but many do.
I'm sure there are people watching this video who aren't INTJs thinking that it's not a specific INTJ trait to believe in social justice, but I think that's missing the point. The point is that JFK became the villain of his own house, his own political party, the community of people that he calls his family, to do what he believes is right for the people that he will never meet. Y'all don't have to agree with me, but I don't think most people are willing to give up family for what is morally correct. It takes a very strong sense of justice that I just don't see in most people. The second moment of JFK's presidency that I like to highlight is one of the darkest moments in U.S. history. It's about the international arms race for nuclear weapons, which led to what is known in the U.S. as the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 1962, the U.S. was on the brink of a nuclear fallout when Soviet Russia shipped ballistic missiles to Cuba to strengthen their relationship with then dictator Fidel Castro. In a nutshell, Cuba had nuclear missiles ready to shoot at us, and we were ready to bomb Cuba off the face of the map. Before I continue, I want to add context to the depth of the situation. The US is very fortunate geographically. We share North America with two countries that we will probably never go to war with, our sister countries, Canada above us and Mexico below us. And the threat of invasion from another country is highly unlikely because we also have two vast oceans on our side, so that if they wanted to invade us, they'd have to go through one of our sister countries first. There are lots of other factors that come into play to prevent invasion or terrorism on the mainland, but the main point still remains true. Attacks on U.S. soil has historically been rare and are usually a blip in history instead of a lingering attack. As examples, December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and September 11th, 2001, when Al-Qaeda attacked New York City. The point is that being attacked on our own land doesn't happen. So imagine the mental state of all Americans when we found out that Cuba can hurt us on our soil. I can't explain the tension that it caused in the U.S. since I wasn't there, But we're lucky because my uncle is here to explain how it felt living in Florida during the crisis. All right, so Uncle, you lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. You and Auntie have already told me how crazy, how much of a panic the state, everyone was in during that time frame. Can you just provide a little bit of context as to what you went through?
Little things were heightened in school, and we learned how to, hide underneath desks, where to hide at home, and kind of like a fallout type of shelter thing. Then when the actual Cuban crisis started taking place, on the news we were following the Russian ships that were moving in towards Cuba and landing in Cuba. And what they were doing, they were offloading their payloads in Cuba, and we did not know. Castro was in power at that time and did not make the world known that Russia was wanting to store nuclear warheads on the island there to, in effect, launch easily into America. At that particular time, it was really frightening in a way because, I was like 9-10 years old at the time. And the one thing that I noticed is we actually had silos in the state of Florida, in gas stations of all places. So the roof would open up like this. On a gas station, it would open up like this, and a warhead would come up like this out of the ground. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And as a kid, I was riding my bike down Dixie Highway there. That's US 1 in Florida. And when we were riding our bikes down there, we could actually see the missiles up in the air, so to speak, higher than the house levels. Yeah, that was a big thing back then. Of course, after the missile crisis took place, they had to reallocate or relocate all these missiles because everybody knew where they were now. But at the time, we came very, very close. Everybody was glued to their TVs too. We were watching, during this whole crisis, the clock was ticking and everybody was pacing back and forth. My parents were absolutely crazy with it. A lot of times they didn't even go to work. They stayed home and glued themselves to the TV waiting to hear what's next. Everybody was high alert and the tension was rising and it was just chaos. Grocery stores were being stripped. Everybody was running, grabbing their last meal. It seemed like that's what it was. They were afraid that if something happened, they wouldn't have any food. And so everybody was buying everything under the sun there. And although, the president came on national TV, quite often to assure everybody, don't panic. People, they panicked anyway, they felt like this was their last supper.
Before I tie in how JFK responded to crisis, I want to note that I am anti-war, anti-genocide of any kind. I am personally a product of refugees flaming their homeland due to the mass genocide. I will always and forever be anti-violence. Free Palestine. History remembers JFK's response as restrained and disciplined. He met with his advisors in secret and announced a naval blockade and quarantine around Cuba. He gave a speech on October 22nd, 1962, that the goal was for both peace and freedom in this hemisphere and around the world. 6 days later, on October 28th, 1962, the US and Soviet Russia arrived to an agreement to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis only lasted 13 days, but it was such a significant moment in US history, and he led us through that. This next part of the video, I want everyone to be aware that it's very speculative. Everyone has their own opinion on everything, and international affairs tend to err towards negativity. To be as objective as possible, I'm only sticking to the facts, saying what actually happened instead of what could have happened or theorized meaning. JFK wasn't perfect. A year prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK authorized a failed coup to dethrone Fidel Castro, so it makes sense for Cuba to look for a way to retaliate. But the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't the only international bloodshed that JFK, the US, was involved in or trying to avoid. During the same time frame, communism was getting huge, so he started sending more troops to Vietnam. But I want to emphasize that the Vietnam War started after JFK was assassinated during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. He just sent troops there, and again, who knows what his plan was. But Vietnam wasn't the only country that communist insurgency were happening. JFK rejected a military proposal to send American troops to the country of Laos. And personally speaking, this is the same Laos regime that turned my personal family into war-torn refugees that forced my parents and grandparents to flee the country. I have a personal vendetta against the regime, but I'm glad that he didn't continue to make orphans by sending US troops for that war. And lastly, there was the Cold War. In a nutshell, the Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension marked by competition and confrontation between communist-led Soviet Union and Western democracies such as the US. In 1961, JFK went to Austria for a summit to meet with the Soviet leader. I'm not going to pronounce his name because I'll butcher it, but it didn't go well. The result was JFK addressing the American people. We might have to send troops to Berlin to protect them. So to summarize, JFK failed an assassination attempt in Cuba. His intentions are still unclear for why he was sending troops to Vietnam. It is unknown whether U.S. participation could have helped the country of Laos during its civil war, and there are very valid arguments that he could have handled his meeting with Soviet Russia better. As mentioned earlier, I'm not going to defend anything that he did, but these are the facts. There are moments where he fucked up as president, and the point of this section is that he made mistakes. He's not perfect, but again, this is what he went through as president. The final part of JFK's presidency that I want to go over was his involvement with the American space program, commonly known as NASA. On May 25th, 1961, JFK announced to Congress his ambitious goal of safely sending an American to the moon and back before the end of the decade. Look, if you've been to my channel before, you know I hate stereotypes or putting limitations on people due to the stacking of their cognitive functions. But it takes a highly intuitive and competitive person to be like, yo, American people, you know the moon? The thing that's stuck in the sky at night? I know we've never been there before or tried sending a person there, but we're going to send a person to the moon this decade. And not only are we going to do that, we're actually going to beat the Soviets to it. As an American myself, a person born and raised in this country, I admit, guys, we're ignorant. But we're ignorant because we're limitless in our capabilities and we have the achievements to back it up. Not only are we capable in sensory achievements such as being the nation with the most medals won in Olympic history, or capable in regards to creating culture like music such as rock, hip-hop, or techno, or house music, hundreds of blockbuster movies from Hollywood are making a niche genre internationally acclaimed like WWE wrestling, NBA basketball, or the creation of YouTube. It doesn't stop there. We're also fucking smart. JFK not only told a nation that we're going to send a person to the moon, but he made people believe it was possible. Anyone can say that we're going to send a person to the moon, but it takes a very convincing person to have the entire nation believe it. I try not to gas up INTJs too much in my videos because I think majority of us already do that to ourselves naturally. But one of the superpower of being a healthy INTJ, once you learn how to use all your functions, is that you're naturally inspirational. A healthy INTJ will use extrovert sensing to command the room to get everyone to listen, while extrovert thinking and introvert feeling will partner up to explain our plan that will be presented in a way where thinkers will see that as logically sound and feelers will believe that it aligns with their own internal values. And lastly, NI. Introvert intuition is in the helm, the driver's seat, telling everyone that there is no impossible and that we could achieve anything that we set our mind to. This is exactly what JFK did with the U.S. space program.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
A few years before the speech, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite by the name of Sputnik 1. It was a huge advancement in human technology in addition to advancement in military capabilities. It was theorized that Sputnik could allow the Soviets to launch ballistic missiles anywhere. Americans experienced a range of emotions including fear and anxiety, where one newspaper headline even proclaimed, "US must catch up with Reds or we're dead." Reds being another name for the Soviet Union because of the color of the flag. As president, JFK knew the assignment. That in order to restore American confidence, not only did we have to match the Soviets, but we had to surpass them. So as mentioned earlier, on May 25th, 1961, he asked Congress for an additional $7 to $9 billion to fund the space program. Skeptics questioned whether NASA was able to deliver on the promise. But guys, We're the US. Of course we delivered. The next year, on February 20th, 1962, NASA sent the first American to orbit Earth. This is a nerd's dream, and it inspired an army of people working towards reaching the moon, including medical researchers, engineers, test pilots, factory workers, and every profession in between. And with all the additional help and all the additional fundings, on July 20th, 1969, 8 years later, the United States became the first country to safely land a person on the moon and assure their safe return. On that day, America proved that we didn't only have the best athletes in the world or the most influential culture, but we're also the most intelligent and capable nation in the world. And that was thanks to our president, John F. Kennedy. All right, that's enough, guys. I'll stop gassing the US. I'll tone it down a notch. Look, every huge achievement starts with a dream, but dreaming in itself can only go so far. There has to be a champion for a dream, a spokesperson, or someone that we can turn to spearhead turning that dream into a reality. And the champion for getting a person on the moon was and will forever be John F. Kennedy. I mentioned earlier in the video, JFK was both the youngest president we ever elected, as well as the youngest president to have ever passed away. On November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas by a person named Lee Harvey Oswald. This was the most recent assassination attempt that actually went through for a US president. And as a result, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson sworn into presidency no more than 2 hours later. There are tons of debates and conspiracies as to why he was assassinated, but he was one of 4 major assassinations in the 1960s. 2 years later, in 1965, Malcolm X, a prominent figure in the civil rights movement, was assassinated. 5 years later, in 1968, another prominent figure of the civil rights movement by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Lastly, during the same year of 1968, JFK's younger brother Robert was campaigning to become the next president, and he was also assassinated. I think the pattern is pretty clear. They were all assassinated because they were very powerful men that vocally supported the civil rights movement. This is probably the longest video that I will ever make, and it took about 4 months to write the script. Not because the information isn't out there, but because the more I read about JFK, the more I wanted to make sure that the message is extremely clear. That there's a theme to the examples that I decided to showcase in this video. Whether it was before his presidency or during his presidency, JFK lived a life that was authentic to himself that allowed him to achieve greatness. Whether those decisions succeeded or failed, or whether they were popular or unpopular, he used his position of power to elevate other people. The sad thing about JFK's presidency is that he didn't live long enough to see the fruits of his labor. He passed away before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed. He passed away before the end of the Cold War. He passed away before the US landed the first person on the moon. It's sad to think about, but I'm sure that he's just as happy knowing that he left a positive influence in the world. At a young age, he decided that equality for all human was a natural born right. At a young age, he became a war hero and saved the lives of his men regardless of how difficult or dire the situation. At a young age, he wrote about powerful people going against a system that created them to do what is morally correct. And as an adult, he followed through. As an adult, he became the most powerful person in the United States, telling everyone around the world that racial injustice is just plain wrong. As an adult, he continued to be a hero by negotiating peace deals, stopping a nuclear fallout that would have resulted in countless innocent lives. And as an adult, he decided that being a good person meant going against the system that raised them. A common complaint about INTJs is that most people claim to not know our objective or that we seem to constantly be scheming. Most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, people just aren't listening and are projecting their own insecurities onto us. Because if you take the time to actually listen to a healthy INTJ, you will learn that we are consistent with our beliefs. And our beliefs tend to lean towards justice and justice for all.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.